Well, hello everyone. I'm Mike Pearce, Corporate Partnerships Director at the Climate Group. I'd like to extend a really warm welcome to our event, Net Zero Steel, what does it mean and how do we get there? We're excited to have such an impressive panel of experts join us here today to discuss a hugely complex and important issue on the future of steel. Steel is the world's most widely used material, from buildings to bridges, scissors to saucepans, cars to wind turbines. It's found in almost every aspect of our life. Steelmaking is also one of the biggest emitters of CO2 globally today. Total emissions from the steel sector alone account for roughly 7% of global emissions, and this is projected to rise in line with increasing demand. Yet the technologies do exist for steel production to be decarbonised. We have less than 10 years to halve global carbon emissions to get the world on track to reach net zero by 2050. Decarbonising steel production is critical to achieving this goal, and we must take action now. And that's why we're really proud to launch a new initiative, SteelZero. Run by the Climate Group in partnership with ResponsibleSteel, SteelZero is a global initiative that brings together forward-looking organisations to drive transformation in the steel sector. Organisations that join SteelZero commit to procuring, specifying or stocking 100% net zero steel by 2050. This will send a strong demand signal that can shift markets and policies towards responsible production and sourcing of steel. I'm truly delighted to say we have 8 leading businesses signed up to SteelZero today, marking the beginning of a significant global push for clean steel. We look forward to working with and supporting our first members, namely BHC, Bourne Group, Grosvenor Britain and Ireland, Lend-Lease, Mace Group, Multiplex Construction Europe, Ørsted and WSP UK in their commitment to net zero steel and growing our network together. To give you a better idea about SteelZero, we're now going to play a quick video.
Steel sector emissions account for over 7% of global greenhouse gas emissions. It's vitally important that the steel sector works towards a much more responsible and sustainable way of producing steel over the next few years. SteelZero is a really exciting new initiative that is being run by the Climate Group and ResponsibleSteel, all geared around a steel industry that is working to be net zero by 2050.
As one of the 5 largest renewable energy companies in the world, procuring a lot of steel every year, if we want to reach net zero in our supply chain in 20 years from now, there needs to be a commercially viable steel production which is carbon neutral. It will require major innovation. It's a challenge we need to solve as a global community and as a global industry. That's why it's very beneficial for us to be part of SteelZero, because this is obviously not something we can do alone.
Our mission at the Climate Group is to drive climate action fast. It is inevitable that the steel sector is going to have to adapt. Organizations that act now and plan for net zero steel will be better positioned in the future.
We've been working so far with many companies and organisations in the construction sector, in the automotive sector and in the renewable energy sector. These companies that are joining SteelZero will be part of a global movement that is taking and showing a very strong demand signal back to steel makers and producers in the move towards producing responsible zero carbon steel.
So today's panel will discuss the role that organisations can play in driving demand for responsible materials and explore what it will take for the steel industry to reach net zero. There'll also be a 10-minute Q&A for the audience, so please do add any questions for the panel into the questions box as we go along. So now, I'm delighted to hand over to our moderator, the International Business Editor of the Financial Times, Peggy Hollinger, who will introduce the panelists.
Hello, and thank you very much, Mike, and thank you to the audience for attending this event today. We have a fantastic panel of experts, as Mike said, and I hope it'll be an interesting discussion for all of you in this really critical area. So first off, we have, you saw him in the video, Jakob Askau-Börs, forgive the pronunciation, Jakob, Senior Vice President, Corporate Strategy and Stakeholder Relations of Ørsted, the renewable energy company. We have Kate Harris, Group Head of Sustainability and the Lend-Lease Foundation at the property developer Lend-Lease, which ranges everything from urban areas to retail centers to stadia. We have Dr. Alan Knight, Head of Corporate Responsibility and Sustainable Development at ArcelorMittal, one of the world's largest steel producers. And finally, Dirk Nuyens, Senior Partner and Global Account Director in charge of steel and mining at the consultancy that has spent the last 50 years offering advice to companies on sustainability, environmental resources management. So I suppose first off, I mean, in this, I hope this discussion, panelists, I hope you dive in when you hear things. We want it to be a lively conversation, and we'll also be asking the audience to participate. Audience, you're not off the hook. You're going to have to answer some of the poll questions as we go through this. So you will have some idea, we will have some idea of what you're thinking, and hopefully maybe the conversation will help to influence your views and be useful to you in your working life. So I'd like to kick off the conversation. I mean, one of the things you heard in the video, steel is, almost like oxygen. It's in everything that we use. It's everywhere. It's vitally important for the societies that we have today. I suppose one of the things that I wonder is it really possible to decarbonize steel? We have assets out there, blast furnaces that have been going for a very long time. We've been making steel in a very traditional way for a very long time. It's a mammoth task. Can it ever be carbon neutral? And I think for that, I might head to Dirk first, because you've looked at the whole panoply of companies around the place. Is it actually possible to have carbon neutral steel production?
Indeed, Peggy, it's possible. We have the technologies. I think there's a couple of enablers that we need to work. For example, the regulatory framework, it's not completely, there yet. Carbon tax is a big uncertainty. And also the funding is quite critical. I think, the investment that is needed to go for decarbonization, we'll talk maybe about that a little bit later, but it's quite significant. And so that's really also one of the roadblocks. But yes, we can decarbonize. The technologies are there. The interest of both the value chain is there. We need some support from the regulators. We need, investment. We need sustainable finance. But it can happen. But we will need time, because it will take time. It's not something that we can make happen in, let's say, 10 years. It will be a journey of about 25, 30 years. There will be hybrid solutions needed, to work the whole decarbonization journey. But it's going to be an interesting journey for sure.
Thank you, Dirk. I think I'd like to turn to Alan Knight now and just say, well, so we've heard that there's an optimism out there that we can do this. What, from you as a steel producer, what is the most important step that needs to be taken in order to put us on that path to decarbonizing steel when you look at what you're going to have to do?
Yeah, so we share that optimism. Technically, it is possible to make steel without carbon. Indeed, there's already, you can make steel without carbon using scrap renewables. We don't do that because there's not enough scrap in the world to do that, but that is a long-term trend. So the focus is, how do you make primary steel? How do you convert iron ore into steel without carbon? Two routes: one where you carry on using carbon but you recycle it or store it. Another one is hydrogen. I could talk for another hour. You won't let me on unpacking that. But the headline is, we share that technically it is possible to make steel without carbon. It's the economics. It's how do we make that steel and be able to sell it against a market which is making steel in the carbon emitting way. So the two interventions we need is policy. What policy devices out there can make our steel more competitive, even though there's cost implication, but also the market itself. Would the market go out its way and choose steel made with these new technologies? And that's why, at a very deep fundamental level, we welcome this initiative. a market signal to actually encourage us, incentivize us, reward us for doing this is so fundamentally important. So technically we can do it, but we need the economics, and this initiative helps bridge that gap.
Fantastic. Well, the question about the market, I'm going to turn over to the consumers of your product. Kate, are you really willing to pay more for your steel that this is going to require? I mean, why do you think this initiative is important, and how much sacrifice are you willing to make in order to ensure its success?
Yes, so I think we're absolutely in it because we see a need to create that demand-supply ratio within the market, so that it's not necessarily a focus on what extra we're willing to pay, but how we actually create a commercially viable market in this space. And as Alan referred to, it's about getting a whole series of steps and actors in this space to actually play their part right up and down through the supply chain and the value chain of steel. We ourselves have set very ambitious sustainability targets, particularly climate, looking to be a 1.5 degree aligned company with net zero scope 1 and 2 target for 2025 and an absolute zero target for our scope 1, 2 and 3 by 2040. Steel is part of our scope 3 emissions, and we've acknowledged through setting these targets that we can't achieve these on our own, and that they will take many others to come along on this journey with us. And we acknowledge the fact that we need to work and collaborate and innovate with our supply chain, both up and down the line, to create the right mechanisms to get the economics to stack up at the end of the day. So everything from our demand side with our clients, our external clients, also our investors, etc., to come on this journey with us and be looking to specify the use of more responsible product, but also to working with our suppliers and working through partnership and innovation in terms of the product opportunities that Alan referred to.
Thank you, Kate. And Jakob, you as well. I mean, wind turbines are essentially made of steel. So, potentially you could see a huge increase in your costs as we go towards green steel, but yet you say you're still committed to having this initiative work. So explain to me how you're willing to square that circle, higher operating or higher manufacturing costs because your raw material will cost more versus the goal of sustainability. What's in it for you?
Well, at the core of it, this is a major innovation challenge for the steel industry and for us as consumers of steel, and that is an innovation challenge that we need to solve together. And it's not unlike the journey that we've been on in renewable energy and in offshore wind over the past decade. If you go back to 2012, offshore wind was among the most expensive energy technologies available, and everybody were asking the same question as you were asking regarding steel. Is this really possible to get to a cost competitive level? And in the offshore wind industry, we decided, and Ørsted set some very specific targets to reduce cost by embarking on a scaling and an innovation journey. And that led us to already in 2016 and 17 to actually become cost competitive with fossil fueled power production. So we've seen in our industry that it is possible to solve this challenge, if you will, and it is, as Alan also says, it is something which requires significant innovation. It requires significant market demand, and it requires a lot of policy to make this work. That is what we've seen work in offshore wind, and we're very happy to join this initiative because we have quite a lot of experience about what it takes to go through this journey, and that's also why we're sort of coming out here and saying, I mean, we've set the target to make our supply chain carbon neutral by 2040, And for that to happen, 50% of our supply chain emissions come from steel. So for that to happen, we clearly need carbon-free steel. So it's something that we need to solve together. And I think this is a very strong initiative to bring together these players to really start thinking about how do we get there. And I fully agree with Kate. It's not about sort of signing up to pay a much higher steel cost tomorrow. That would be naive in a way. I mean, we are also in very intense competition for our projects, and of course we need to square our economics as well. But we go into this with a fundamental commitment to embark on this journey to ultimately reach the target that we've communicated very clearly.
Thank you, Jakob. I mean, one of the things that I think I noticed about your journey is you mentioned you set this very ambitious target back in 2012, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. But you set it for 2020, but you reached it by 2016. So there was an unexpected acceleration once there was a certain mass behind it. I think that is your experience. I mean, how do we get that same mass behind this initiative? Because in fact, it's not just about power. It's actually about about steel. It's about the power and the infrastructure for the energy behind it. I mean, Alan, you mentioned hydrogen. I think Dirk, you did as well. This is a vast challenge. I mean, we're looking at setting up, not only developing a technology which doesn't exist yet today to give you the energy that you need to have carbon-free steel, but also the infrastructure. Dirk, talk to me a bit about why are we all optimistic when actually the very first challenge appears to be how are you going to get the energy to make that steel and a clean energy to make that steel?
Well, I have to say with COVID-19, we see an acceleration of interest actually in the transition. You see a lot of companies actually stepping up the plate, looking into how can we speed up, the shift towards cleaner and greener energy. You see a lot of countries actually announcing initiatives, sponsoring funding, research, actually pushing, the drive for hydrogen, but also other alternative cleaner energies. So it's happening. I think the challenge that we see is the demand is going to be needed, out of the steel sector is going to be huge if we really convert completely into blue initially, which is carbon capture plus fossil related hydrogen, which is available now, but the green hydrogen, which comes actually from wind, renewables, will become available at a reasonable price probably in 10 years. So there's a shift going to happen on that, but the demand that is needed actually from the steel sector is so huge that it's actually very difficult for the sector to decide to step already into the investment now. I mean, it needs abundant hydrogen at affordable price, and that's a real challenge. And so we're looking at an acceleration, right? And it is anticipated that in 10-15 years we will go to that tipping point. And at the same time, we should not forget it's also linked to the carbon taxation. The carbon taxation is also anticipated to increase with time. It probably goes up to even 100 by 2050. It will have an impact on the economics also. So you have the two vectors playing on this. So there's a lot of uncertainty at this stage, and also from the investment side. So it is somewhat tricky to say hydrogen is going to be there maybe already in 10 years. It's going to be part of the solution, but we're looking into hybrid solutions. When you look into steel sector at the moment, most of the steel companies are looking into carbon capture, smart carbon, and also weaving in hydrogen in time, also increasing recycling and all that to reduce the footprint. And at a certain moment, as said, if infrastructure is going to be there, which will take probably 10 years to build, and the price is going to be reasonable, then it will go into the hydrogen shift. But it's going to be, a phased approach.
So I'm struck by what we're, again, coming back to the price question, the cost question, the uncertainty of hydrogen. So Alan, ArcelorMittal is going to be paying vastly higher prices for clean steel if hydrogen is going to take another 10, 15 years to become affordable, if you like, competitive. And Jakob and Kate, your companies are going to be paying more because Alan's paying more, because that's just the way it goes. I'd like to throw in a poll question right here, because ultimately all of this comes down to the end consumer. And I'd like to chuck in a poll question for our audience here. We're all here because we believe, I presume, we believe that, you know, this is something we have to do. It's urgent, it's a priority. But how many of you as consumers are going to be willing to pay a premium for goods made with sustainable materials? We are entering a world, post-COVID world, where lots of unemployment, uncertainty. I won't even throw in Brexit. Okay, I just did, but you know, in the UK, there's so much uncertainty. How many of you as consumers would pay a premium for goods made with sustainable materials? And the answer, yes, no, don't know. We can come back to the results afterwards. Put your money where your mouth is. Let's see. So coming back to the questions then, I'd like to ask Alan, you know, we're talking about a lot of cost here. You have lots of legacy assets. How much do you estimate the transition for ArcelorMittal will cost to get to clean steel? And you know, what approaches, technological approaches, are you taking in the shorter term and in the longer term to make that happen?
So the costs are based on a series of assumptions which, you know, will change over time, like we saw with renewable energies. But the numbers are big. It's anything from 30 billion to 60, 70, 80 for our European business. The assumptions we're making at the moment is showing that the routes which rely on circular carbon rather than hydrogen are coming in at a lower cost, which is one of the reasons why we are putting a lot of investment in that. Even though a lot of the other steel sector players talk about hydrogen as a solution, it is important to note that there are other solutions. And I think one of the other things as well where this initiative can really help us is actually understand what do we mean by green steel. And for me, there's two angles to that. What actually is the carbon specification? It's not as if tomorrow we'll be making a small percentage of zero carbon steel. We will be reducing our carbon footprint of our steel with different technologies being turned on in different places, making different types of steel. And you know, we think there are criteria this group has set themselves on specifying green steel or low carbon steel. We think there's others, you know, and we really would like to use this group to discuss the other choices buyers have in actually choosing the right types of steels and who to buy them from. And the other thing as well, to sort of add to the complexity of this, we will be letting our customers down if we don't address the other ESG issues, you know, human rights, the other forms of pollution. And it's absolutely right that this is a carbon agenda, but we, to protect our own stakeholders and our customers' interests, have to look at all ESG issues, which is why this partnership with Responsible Steel is so important. Let's not make carbon the only game in town at the expense of the other ESG issues. So we've got to work out how we do that as well.
I mean, it's interesting to me how all of this is really accelerated in the COVID world, the ESG issues, the carbon. I mean, yes, they're all important, but in a way, carbon is the very sustainability of the planet. You know, that's an issue that threatens all of our existence. So I wonder, the thing that also really strikes me is that the financial community seems to have got religion, if you like, all of a sudden in the last 12 months. Kate, I'd be interested to know from you, what kinds of pressures are you under in order to deliver this? Both of you and Jakob have talked about the supply chain and making it carbon neutral. But how are you coming under pressure, whether it be from customers or your own investors?
Yeah, certainly from an investor perspective, we're seeing, again, a growth in terms of appetite and inquiry around all things climate related and broader ESG issues, as Alan referred to. You know, we've seen a groundswell, I think, in terms of the adoption of frameworks and mechanisms like the Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosure, TCFD, and being much more accountable as an organisation for the impacts of climate and carbon on our business and business models. And also the opportunities associated with that as well. But look, more and more we're being asked by our investors who are investing in our funds platforms and mandates around the sustainability performance of those funds. And just in recent weeks, we've had results out from the global real estate benchmarking scheme, GRESB, again, just sort of highlighting how strong the sense of sustainability and ESG performance is across certainly the property and real estate sector, and the need to be able to demonstrate that performance. So there's that part of our value chain, and then also to external clients that we deliver built form outcomes for, and a proportion of that are also government clients and cities, etc. So there's an interesting dynamic too in terms of the policy agenda, as well as government as a client of built form and infrastructure outcomes, and what they're specifying and how they can play a role in terms of creating an equal playing field in competitive tender scenarios. Again, just all helping put all those pieces together in terms of getting that right value outcome.
Fascinating. So yeah, the public tender being an issue, it's going to become a criteria. I mean, Jakob, I guess for you as well, that pressure both from where you're tendering to supply your energy. I noticed a Bloomberg article very recently that said Ørsted had a higher market cap than BP. I didn't double check this, so I can't sort of verify the truth of that, but I was really struck, and they talked about the
You can trust Bloomberg in this.
Okay. But it does show that investors are beginning to really put their money where their mouth is as well. Are you feeling that very strongly? Do you feel that it's impossible now not to be focusing on carbon free right the way through the supply chain?
Well, I'd say it's part of our commitment and our value proposition to our investors and our stakeholders is to be at the forefront of leading the decarbonization. As a company, we will become carbon neutral in scope 1 and 2 by 2025. And then we've set the target to become carbon neutral in scope 3 by 2040, 10 years ahead of sort of the general consensus of reaching carbon neutrality in 2050. So it's clearly part of our value proposition and part of what our investor base and stakeholders expect from us. And that's also why we are embarking on this journey to work together with the steel industry on this. And I very much agree with what Alan says. It's not like there will be carbon neutral steel coming out of the mill from one day to the other. It's a continuous journey. I mean, the way we're doing it is we're taking our entire supply chain and all the different components, then we're measuring sort of how much emission comes from each part. And then what we're going to do is we're going to sit down with our suppliers on each of the components and do roadmaps and say, what are your initiatives to bring down? What are your initiatives to bring down? When do you see that sort of a next generation of technology is going to take place? And so I think you need to address it sort of in this very granular fashion. And I think with respect to steel, it's pretty much the same as what we saw with offshore wind. The innovation is going to come with the new volumes being built. So at some point when the steel industry has sort of established its technology roadmap, so to say, and it seems like you're sort of really converging in on what the hypothesis is, then the next big question becomes then, okay, how do we then increase demand and volume for these particular sort of types of steel produced in a more sustainable way? And then that becomes the challenge to solve. How can we find some market demand so that we can build this new plant, which then operates on a new sort of technology platform, and so it's sort of a series of challenges that you need to solve on the way, rather than saying, would you like to pay twice or triple the cost of steel tomorrow? And that's what we've seen in offshore wind, and I'm sure that formula is going to play out the same way here.
Brilliant. And Dirk, you're nodding, and I want to come to you next, but I want to throw in a little bit, I want to be a little bit provocative here. So you, the customers, Kate, Lend-Lease, Jakob at Ørsted, not just you, I'm not pointing the finger at you, but in general, users of steel, we have seen, of European steel, have been opting to buy imported steel over the last few years because it's cheaper. Now, my question would be, how can we be sure that if we want to build the volume, and if we're talking about European steel here, you want to build the volume, you have to make commitments to buy that steel. There have to be hard and fast commitments to buy that steel. And we have seen, Chinese imports really push down prices even more, making life tougher for the European steel makers. And Alan, how confident are you that you're not going to face kind of what are the ways to ensure that there won't be a lot of dumping of green steel from other regions, or that you'll have the time and the breathing space to build the facilities you need to produce green steel?
Well, I think the first thing is actually creating a level playing field. You know, if the world is competing against green steel, we're in a better place than the world competing with green steel versus ungreen steel. And so we've put a lot of focus at the moment on a carbon border adjustment, particularly for Europe, where we pay a price on emitting carbon into the sky, which our competitors don't. So what we're saying, we should put a price on carbon on steel for steel used in Europe, not for steel only made in Europe, to level the playing field a bit. And I think the other thing we need to do, and it goes back to the standards question, just exactly what can the buyer ask for to get green steel? Because we're going to have many different companies making their own versions of green steel and their own claims, and some will be greener than others. Some will be based on carbon, some will be based on ESG issues. So we do need to use this group and other groups to really talk about what is the customer specification and how do we apply that in a fair and even way. Because we saw in the 90s green claims and people were all getting very confused. The answer might lie within responsible steel, it might lie elsewhere. But we do need to govern the terminology and the standards for green steel. And we do need public policy such as the carbon border adjustment to ensure that we can't compete with ungreen steel. You know, I think the dumping of green steel from China is a very different conversation to the dumping of ungreen steel from China. And so we've got to keep, you know, there's two different debates going on there. Our focus here is just what is green steel and how do we make it competitive?
Absolutely vital. Thank you, Alan. Dirk, are you able to communicate? Perfect.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me again?
Now we can hear you. So
thanks for jumping in, Alan.
Yeah, your views on the sort of competitive aspect, laying level playing fields, and the threat of imported steel.
I think
perhaps.
Yeah, I think there's a role to be played by not only the customers but also by public, tendering. You could indeed specify that you want, companies to work with green steel actually developed in Europe, produced in Europe, in a sustainable way. So actually creating the demand and actually promoting it, that you might make it more, interesting for companies to go for it, but also making it more affordable. And that's where, the regulatory framework and, the carbon taxation needs to come in, because, the carbon border adjustment is quite crucial. And I think it's still a challenge, because we see indeed a lot of cheap, I would say, carbon hostile, I would say, steel being dumped on the European market. And so there's still an important role to be played by the European Union to actually, counter that. And, if we really want to push green steel and make it successful, we have to counter, but we also have to promote, that's for sure.
Thank you. Actually, I'm going to throw another poll question in, because both of you have talked about the border adjustment mechanism, and it would be very interesting to know from our audience, which is several hundred strong, and that's encouraging. What are your views, audience? Would you support a carbon border adjustment mechanism to accelerate the transition to net zero steel? Obviously, carbon border adjustment mechanism, that's a mouthful, will add cost to imported steel. So is it your view that this is something that we should implement in order to support this transition, or not? So if you could respond to the question on your screens. So we'll come back again now to the question of European steel versus imported steel. Dirk, you mentioned when last we spoke that the Chinese companies are doing quite a lot on renewable steel. I think it would be interesting for people perhaps who don't know, what are we seeing? Are they ahead of the game in terms of versus European producers? Are they behind? I know that two of the biggest energy companies recently in steel, two of the biggest energy companies recently merged to create sort of a green energy company, sort of feeding into the conversation we were having about green energy to help with the steel industry. Where are the Chinese, who've had arguably the biggest impact on the steel pricing in Europe? Where are they vis-a-vis the Europeans?
Well, they still have a long way to go, but what we see happening is that their learning curve is very steep, and there's real interest actually to accelerate. There's partnerships being built not only internally in China, but also within Asia Pacific and beyond, where we see indeed hydrogen being introduced, alternative technologies, and it is clear that the Chinese companies are preparing themselves a bit faster than I think than some of the American or maybe some of the European ones in acceleration, which is quite interesting. India is the same. I think India is also moving quite rapidly, and as you know, the demand for steel is probably going to increase more rapidly in India over the coming 25, 30 years. Well, it is anticipated to decline in China actually, but still, we see the acceleration going also pretty fast, which is something you would not anticipate, having a relatively bad image at the moment from Chinese and some Indian steel. Yeah.
Thank you. I actually want to return briefly to a question that I asked earlier, because again, we can see the competition is out there doing the same things that the European steel producers want to do. Everybody's aware this is clearly a global issue. The cost issue here, if you have Chinese companies who, I think it's widely accepted that China often subsidizes energy costs for companies. There are a wide range of subsidies for Chinese steel that allow Chinese steel to be sold at lower cost. Alan, I want to come back to you. I don't think you mentioned a figure. I've read a figure that it might cost about 50 billion euros to go entirely green when you think about all the investment a company has to make in order to make that transition. Is that a figure you recognize? And how on earth would a company like ArcelorMittal even begin to think about investing that amount to become a green company? And what does government, does society have a role in subsidizing that?
So yeah, those sorts of numbers we do recognise, and I think there's several ways we can help here. So well, firstly, what do we do with steel made the old-fashioned way? Are they going to pay an even higher price on carbon? That's the whole philosophy of a price on carbon, is to help narrow that price difference or reverse that price difference. Of course, there will be a big scope for innovation. People talk a lot about the cost of hydrogen going down, and we've seen the renewable story where that seems to have gone at a faster pace. There is definitely a case for things like the Green Deal helping us out. There's a lot of talk about green bonds, transition bonds, access to finance. So I think for us, the biggest issue isn't actually, believe it or not, the sum of money. It's about the market and policy certainties to spend that amount of money. Mm-hmm. Otherwise you can't go to shareholders and say, can we borrow this amount of money from the bank, but we're not sure if it's going to pay us back? They would resist. So it's the certainty we need. And that's why the public policy debate is important. And that's why this initiative is important, because if we've got more and more of the bigger buyers saying, look, we really mean this, we're looking for this, we can then make those types of investments. And we then can also together go to public policy makers and say, can you make the life of the companies not making these investments more difficult? Because you're wanting to go to a zero carbon Europe, but you're asking us to take all the risks. Can you push the risks onto the people in Europe who aren't making those commitments? And so the sum of money isn't as scary as it sounds. It's the certainty and a collaboration between policy, the market, and the steel makers is the way forward. The more certain we are, the more we can borrow.
I think to add to that, Peggy, we sort of call these opportunities and these sorts of forums, a collaborative of unlikely allies, essentially. So groups that you wouldn't necessarily always see working together and pulling in the same direction, but when we do, that's when we've got the potential to create a scale of solution and scale of outcome. And I think that is what is so exciting and appealing to all of us that have joined this initiative early, is to signal and to encourage others to continue to join with us in bringing, whether it's peers and competitors, along on that journey. Because if we do get that scale of the right players around the table having these discussions, and as Alan said, if we can then advocate for the same sort of directives, etc., up and down the value chain and to policymakers, etc., then we stand a much better chance of getting the shift that we need within this sector to really create the change that's necessary to meet our targets, to meet the needs of the planet, etc.
It sounds ideal, actually, having a group like this, as long as people actually do actually implement what they're promising to implement. You know, people have to actually do what they say they're going to do. I suppose one other thing that crops up, and you mentioned earlier, Alan, that ArcelorMittal was looking at the circular economy, for example. One thought that strikes me, and I'm wondering from the consumers, so Jakob and Kate, you know, different business models that might be considered. So in terms of, you know, I think in one of our conversations, someone mentioned previous to this session, possibly renting the steel that you use to make your windmills or build your retail parks or your stadia. I mean, is that something you as a customer would consider? Do you see that kind of leasing model, Alan, working in steel companies? Dirk, have you seen this anywhere else? Who would like to go first? I'd be curious to know whether we are thinking, this group is thinking about something maybe as radical as that. Jakob, do you want to start
well,
first?
I think we should think about all possible solutions. I mean, the whole circular economy is another major theme, and steel, at least to my knowledge, is a material that actually can preserve its properties quite well. So why not think in this direction? I think we need to look at all types of levers here. And I'd just like to get back to comment on the discussion about cross-border and competition towards the lowest common denominator. I frankly don't think we should be worrying too much about what the lowest common denominator will be doing at this point in time, because I think this market and this transformation will be driven by a customer segment that values green steel and that sort of engages in procuring this type of steel. And there will be market segments that will go for the lowest possible price no matter what. That's also what we've seen in renewable energy. But now it's actually cheaper to buy renewable energy than it is to buy fossil-based energy. So I think we need to imagine that there will be a time where carbon-free steel will actually be the cost-competitive solution, and really work our way towards that. And that needs to be led by the ones who want this product in a way, but it also comes back to what Alan says. Then we need to start discussing, how is this product defined? What are the characteristics, etc., etc. So we're really starting from sort of defining the product in a way.
Okay, thank you very much. And Dirk, your view on new business models, do you think they will be crucial to getting this kind of carbon neutral economy in steel?
I think we need to look into that, you know, for sure. I mean, it's like in the automotive business, they're reflecting on, you know, are we going to own a car? You know, you see the millennials not being so interested no more in actually owning a car. So you could ask yourself also, do we have alternative business models that could apply to steel? You look into construction, and Kate can maybe confirm in Lend-Lease, you know, you could be looking into recovering, recycling, you know, the steel that actually with some refurnishing or even remelting and you know, in an electric arc, you can give it a new life. And so maybe even the concept of circular steel could be looked upon as a standard. I think it's you know, it's like in the automotive where you have the e-vehicles coming up. You know, the Shell, Total, and the likes. You know, they're not going to sell gasoline no more. But what are they going to do with, you know, the batteries? Are they going into a franchise concept? Are they going to, you know, recharge system? And hydrogen is coming up. So you see also there a quite important shift. And I think the steel industry and you know, the whole supply chain needs to be open to new business models, because it will help us to get more, you know, to sustainability and to circular. And so it's a way to go for sure.
Thank you. So we're almost up to time for the Q&A, but I'm going to throw out the final poll question to our audience, and it comes back to the cost that this transition is going to impose, both on the producers of steel and the users of steel. And bear in mind that we're going to have two systems running at the same time, because as you said, Alan, the transition isn't going to happen overnight. So we will have to have traditional steel being produced even while companies are investing in producing new steel, and customers are having to buy a mixture of both, and that means double cost for a period of time. So the question is whether the industry and the consumers can actually afford this transition. We're talking 50 billion maybe just for one company alone. So the poll question is, should taxpayer money be used to support decarbonization of the steel industry? Do you think this is something the taxpayer needs to subsidize? Or do you think, frankly, these steel companies have known for a very long time that there is an issue with climate, that investment needed to be made? Have they been delaying it? Or is this something that's really all of society's responsibility because we need and use the steel for our daily lives? So now I'll go to some of the questions from the audience. We have, in fact, been feeding some of those questions through this discussion. And I think the first thing that I would like to ask is, we just asked the taxpayers, do we think that consumers will have to make trade-offs? Will they have to make trade-offs in terms of where they buy their steel, what they use it for? Do we think, what are the trade-offs that consumers and customers will have to make if we're going to have green steel? Who wants to take that question first? Kate, is that something?
Sure. Look, I mean, I think in the construction sector, everything is kind of a trade-off in terms of when we're pursuing, our sustainability targets in particular, looking for the right kind of outcomes, both from an environmental and a social perspective. We're making decisions on various designs and materials used for those designs in any given project. So the steel component is no different to that. And, if we go through a period where it is difficult to source, more lower carbon alternates within steel, then we may look to use, alternates, or look at how we can manage and reduce the amount of steel componentry within designs, etc., to help manage targets overall. But at the same time, if we can get steel moving in the right direction, then it becomes a preferred material potentially over, say, more traditional concrete design, where we might struggle to get the same sort of inroads happening with cement that we're trying to kickstart here with the steel sector. So lots of trade-offs, but it's just part of our industry anyway. So
thank you, Kate. Alan, from a producer's point of view, what do you think?
Yeah, I sort of want to build on what's just been said. Actually, there's quite a lot of trade-ons as a result as we go towards sustainability. If you just look at the bare numbers, steel does compare well with the materials we compete with already. There is a lot more, particularly in the construction sector, about steel reuse, designing buildings to be dismantled. Is designing a building to be dismantled a trade-off or added value? I don't know, but there are gains to be won there. So again, this meeting is about the launch. At last, we've got a great place where we can just talk about this stuff and kick the tires of this stuff and experiment on it's not just how steel is made, it's how steel is used. Is there a reuse economy we can start working? Because if it is, it's going to start with big beams in construction. And how do you make that go back to your earlier question about what is the business model which makes that work for everybody? These questions need to be answered because they're being asked. But I don't think there really is a trade-off in the transition from steel as it's made today to green steel, other than the questions you've been asking. I think there's lots of opportunities for more creativity and working in different ways, which will change the business models we operate in.
Thank you. Actually, I think I'd like to come to Dirk for the next question, because we're just presuming, you referred to it earlier, Alan, that, what is green steel? How can we ensure that steel producers are actually being transparent about what their CO2 emissions actually are. I mean, Derek, have you seen different models for this? I mean, how would you suggest that, you know, the consumer has the confidence to know that if someone's put this stamp on this steel, that it is what it says it is?
Well, first of all, you have the disclosure, requirements that companies have to do with respect to their emissions. But when you look into the Responsible Steel initiative, actually it prescribes what needs to be done, and is from a multi-stakeholder perspective, not only the CO2, but with respect of greenhouse gases, it clearly specifies what is required, and the whole supply chain, by the way, on why. How it's being produced, and whether it fits, yes or no, the Responsible Steel logo. And I think that is being developed standard. There's already some audits being done, initial audits, and I think it's going to drive the brand, the benchmark in the sector as a standard. I think it's being done by independent auditors, certified auditors that actually will do the audits. So there's definitely certification and independent transparency that is linked to that. So I think it's going to be an interesting, rollout. It's happening as we speak. So, yeah.
Thank you. I mean, Alan, did you? Sorry, I thought you were about to say something.
Yeah, no, the standards is sort of sounds like a bit of a nerdy, boring question, but it's the fundamental, most important question. It's, what is low carbon steel? What is zero carbon steel? How do we prove it? What do you actually include in a world of hydrogen and biomass? Do you include the making of that in the equation, or just the steel making bit? And how do we prove that what we're saying is truthful? So what is the standard? How do you prove truthful? Back to, and what about the other environmental and social issues as well? And I think we really should use this group to test all those models. We have a very simple model now where we pool all our savings and we sell them as certificates. So it's more like an offset than actual green steel. Is that useful for the market? It's simple, it's clear, but it's more of an offset model than a solid product model. What a great place just to talk this through and come up with models which work for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So it feels to me, this initiative absolutely vital, and for all those listening, even more vital to get more members into this, to get that critical scale of demand, so that everyone will benefit, hopefully that virtuous circle going. Well, I think we're coming very close to the end here, and I think it's about time to reveal the poll question results, and they're really interesting, actually. So the first one was, would you be prepared to pay a premium? Remarkably, 70% of our audience said they would pay a premium. Only 12% said no, and 18% didn't really have a view. But it seems 3/4 of those almost that are here say they're willing to pay. I'll be interested to see when it comes to take the money out of your pocketbook, whether you will do it or not. I know I'm always saying things, and then when I go in and look at things in the shops, I'm a little bit worried, but and especially in the post-COVID world. But I think that's encouraging. I think that's really encouraging. And second of all, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, remarkably, even stronger voice of support. 78% say yes, absolutely. They would support a carbon border adjustment mechanism. Only 8% said no, so very little opposition, and 13% don't have a view. And this is the one that is really interesting. So, should we use taxpayer money? This is going to be a phenomenal challenge. And interestingly, the audience is pretty divided on this. 49% say yes, 41% say absolutely not. I've added the absolutely, but no. And then 10% say they don't know. So I think all of you have a bit of a challenge on your hands, because you're pretty much on your own, according to our audience. 49% versus no or don't know, 51% no or don't know. So it is a challenge. I can see the scale of this is absolutely huge, but we need steel. I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, Alan, doesn't feel like there are any new innovative materials or technologies that are about to replace steel in the next 10 years. Would that be the case? I mean, why can't we invent something that could replace steel?
Well, we've already invented it. I mean, it's 100% circular. It already has a lower carbon footprint. The science allows us to get us to zero. it's cheap, and it's 100% recyclable, even reusable. So we've invented a really sustainable material. We just got to change the way we make it, and we need the market to help us.
Brilliant. I think there's no better note on which to end this, and I'm going to hand back to Mike. Thank you very much to the audience for participating in our poll, and especially to the panelists who've been absolutely fascinating. I've learned a lot. I hope you have too. Over to you, Mike.
Well, what a great conversation. And look, let me echo Peggy's thanks there to our panelists, Jakob, Kate, Alan and Dirk, for what was an incredibly insightful discussion. Particular thanks also to Peggy for her expert sharing of the conversation, being able to read the various messages about the poll findings and also pick up all the questions which, as she said, she wove into the conversation today. We've had a really exciting year this year in developing the SteelZero group, and it's terrific to see it land in the world today. It's been very gratifying that so many of you have joined the conversation. As Peggy said, several hundred here today. And with that, great to see so many thought-provoking questions, which have really highlighted the complex challenge ahead of us in the steel sector. They've also shown how engaged and committed so many people are to finding solutions and leading the way. Businesses who are joining SteelZero are working with their supply chains to transition to net zero steel, and it's encouraging to see the work that's already being done at WSP, at Ørsted, Multiplex, Mace, Lend-Lease, Grosvenor, Bourne Group, BHC, and of course many other firms in their supply chains. We are over this year looking to join have many other companies join that list. And so for more information about SteelZero, to find out about how you can be involved, please do visit the Climate Group's website or be in touch with me in due course. It leaves me to say thank you for joining, and we look forward to seeing you soon and speaking more about the progress of SteelZero. Thank you.